I yield 5 minutes to the gentlewoman from Alabama, Ms. Sewell, who's been such a magnificent leader on this legislation.
The gentlewoman who's sponsoring H.R. 4 is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I proudly rise to support the rule on H.R. 4, the Voting Rights Advancement Act of 2019. Voting rights are primal. They are the cornerstone of our democracy. No right is more precious to our citizenship than the right of all Americans to be able to vote. When Americans are not able to cast their ballots, their votes are silenced. And we, especially as elected officials, should be alarmed if any American who wants to cast a ballot is unable to cast a ballot. What H.R. 4 does is it restores the Voting Rights Act of 1965 by giving a new coverage formula. In fact, the Roberts Court specifically said in striking down Section 4B that it was outdated. And so H.R. 4 is our efforts, the efforts of three committees, hours of testimony, lots and lots of stakeholders, lots and lots of people who were American citizens not able to vote. It is that effort that led to a narrowly tailored new coverage formula. That new coverage formula does not look back to 1960s or the 1970s. It looks back 25 years. That's 1994 and going forward. And it requires adjudicated violations of voter discrimination. It is narrowly tailored, and it hits the mark as to what the Supreme Court required us to do in saying that Congress could feel free to update its coverage formula. The Supreme Court, and Roberts in his opinion, also said that voter discrimination still existed. It admitted that it still existed. And H.R. 4 is our effort to actually provide a modern-day voter coverage formula that will allow states and jurisdictions with the most egregious forms of discrimination to be required to pre-clear. You know, the Shelby versus Holder decision originated out of Shelby County, Alabama. I'm honored every day to represent Alabama's 7th congressional district. It is a district that knows all too well the importance of voting. You see, my district includes not only Birmingham and Montgomery, but my hometown of Selma, Alabama. And it was on a bridge in my hometown that our colleague John Lewis and so many other foot soldiers bled on that bridge for the equal right of all Americans to be able to vote. This is exactly what H.R. 4 does. It restores to the full protections the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And in so doing, it provides a mechanism by which the most egregious states and localities must pre-clear before the elections. It's so hard to unring the bell once an election has already taken place. So Section 2, while it has been used to litigate and to be able to get good results, it only can occur after the election has taken place. And so I say to you, Mr. Speaker, that this is not only an important piece of legislation for our nation to ensure that every American who has the ability, who's 18 years of age or older, has the right to access a ballot box. It's clear to me that since the Shelby versus Holder decision, so many states have now instituted voter discrimination laws. Some of them have been in the guise of voter fraud. But the Brennan Center and so many others have found that voter fraud happens minusculely in any election. It's not about voter fraud. It's about voter suppression, suppressing the voices of certain Americans. And that is un-American, Mr. Speaker. Just in the 2018 midterm elections alone highlights the voter discrimination that occurred. In Georgia, the Republican candidate for governor used his power as Secretary of State to put 53,000 voter registrations on hold, nearly 70% of which belonged to African American voters. In North Dakota, Republicans established a new requirement that voters must show an ID that they live in a residential street address. It was not enough that they had a P.O. box. That law was a barrier to thousands of Native Americans who live on reservations and use P.O. boxes rather than residential street addresses. And as my colleague from Maryland has shown, in Arizona, Maricopa County, which I think is where my colleague exists, there's still voter discrimination.
Recognized.
So I say in closing, this is a seminal piece of legislation that will restore for the people. And all of us, Republicans and Democrats, should be about making sure it's easier to vote, not harder to vote. I urge my colleagues to vote for the rule and the underlining legislation, H.R. 4. And I yield back the balance of my time.